Happy Resurrection Day.
Yes.
He is alive. Today's the day that we traditionally celebrate Jesus' resurrection. The fact that he conquered the grave, that he left the tomb empty. And that's good news. That's good news because we too will be raised to be like him, which is what Scripture says. But it's every Sunday that we celebrate Jesus' resurrection. It's not just on Easter Sunday. It's every single Sunday that we celebrate the fact that the tomb was left empty. And I want to emphasize that we celebrate that every Sunday. But today specifically, I want us to look at the resurrection. Because there was a time when this joyous news, when this good news seemed like a long way off. Like it seemed like it would never come. For Jesus' disciples, Sunday seemed like a long ways off. They were still living in Friday. They were still living in what they had experienced and what they had witnessed on that Friday. When Jesus was crucified, when Jesus had died on the cross, that was still where they were. Sunday seemed like a long ways off. And haven't you felt that way before too, during your week? That Sunday's a long ways off. And then the week's getting difficult. And I wish it was Sunday. I wish it was that time where I could be with my people and worship God. And remember what Jesus did for me. And feel His love. And know that I am saved. But Sunday's a long ways off. It's only Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. And Sunday is a long ways off. Sometimes we live in that Friday too, where it seems like things are dark, where it seems like things are depressing, where we don't know what to do, where we are gripped by fear. Sometimes we're in that place and we're waiting for Sunday to come, and we're waiting for that good news to penetrate the darkness that resides over us. Jesus' disciples, when he was crucified, they were gripped with fear. They were filled with doubt. And they were without any idea of what it was that they should be doing. Because the one that they loved, the one that they called their Savior, their teacher, their friend, had died. And they needed something to change. They needed something to bring them out of that place of fear. To draw them out of their doubt. They needed some form of clarity in their moments of confusion, so that they would know what it was that they should be doing. And Jesus, he appeared to them. He had risen from the grave and he showed up amongst them. And yet that still wasn't enough. They needed to not just see something, they needed to hear something. When Jesus showed up amongst them, they were still afraid. Because suddenly, someone who they thought was dead was right there with them. Can you imagine if that was you? If you were one of Jesus' disciples and suddenly he was there in the room with you. Suddenly he appeared right in front of you. Suddenly he's walking along the road with you. Suddenly he's there having breakfast with you at your table. That wouldn't be the answer to your fear. That wouldn't be the answer to your doubt. That wouldn't be the answer to the obscurity and the confusion that you had. That would only enhance it. I thought he was dead. What's he doing here now? You would be startled. You would be surprised. You wouldn't know what to say, what to do, what to feel, what to think. They didn't just need to see Jesus. They needed to hear him. They needed his words. They needed reassurance. And oftentimes we focus about what happened in the resurrection. And we focus on the events. But we don't necessarily focus on the things that Jesus said in the resurrection. And hearing God's voice in the resurrection. And that's what I want us to do this morning. And I want you to ask yourself, where do I need to hear God's voice speaking to me in the resurrection? If I'm afraid, or if I'm doubtful, or if I'm struggling with just a lack of purpose and a lack of a sense of what it is I should be doing, Where is God speaking to me in the resurrection through his resurrected Son? I want you to have that mindset this morning that the resurrection isn't just some past event that I'm supposed to recognize and hope that that has significance for my future in this reality that I will be raised. The resurrection is not just this future thing that we're waiting for. It's something that takes place right now when we allow Jesus to speak to us. Those same words of life that he spoke to his disciples. Turn to Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28. Verse 1, it says, "After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. The angel's appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He's not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead, and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you.' So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. But suddenly Jesus met them. 'Greetings,' he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, 'Do not be afraid.'" Jesus' words in the resurrection, "Do not be afraid." Jesus speaks into their place of fear, and into their place of worry and anxiety. And he says, "Do not be afraid." Are you hearing his voice this morning, speaking into your fear? Do not be afraid. John chapter 20, Jesus appears to his disciples. And in verse 19, it says, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord." Do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Can I ask you something? What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? What are your fears? Those things that you wrestle with. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of dying? Are you afraid that you're going to die in an inopportune moment? Maybe you're not going to get to live out your life the way that you want to, and that's something that causes you to feel anxiety. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of the people around you who you love? Are you afraid of them dying? Are you afraid of losing your job? Are you afraid of not having enough money to pay the bills, to pay your mortgage? Are you afraid of dogs? My wife is. Are you afraid of heights? Are you afraid of the dark? My daughter is. What are you afraid of? Jesus in the resurrection speaks into your place of fear and says, "Do not be afraid. Peace be with you." The two Marys that showed up at the tomb, they were afraid. They were struggling with fear. They were wrestling with that emotion and that feeling of fear. One, because they had seen their good friend and their Savior murdered on the cross. And they were a little bit traumatized by that. They were afraid that had happened to Jesus, that could happen to somebody who they loved and who they were so close to, and that it could happen so quickly and so brutally. But they were still going to go to the tomb to see where his body lay. But then when they got there, there was a violent earthquake. I don't know how many of you have ever been in an earthquake, but it's a strange sensation to feel the ground beneath you rumbling, shifting back and forth or up and down, and the things around you going everywhere. But one of the most traumatizing parts about being in an earthquake are the aftershocks, the tremors that follow, because you're already having this heightened sense of alert, but then at any moment, that shaking can start again. These women were traumatized. They were afraid. Put yourself in their shoes. An angel appears to them and says, if you're looking for Jesus, he's not here. He is risen just as he had said. Now go tell the disciples, and you'll see him in Galilee. So they have this inclination that, okay, we're going to get to see Jesus, and if this is real, that means that he is alive. If this is true, that means that he has risen from the grave. But we still haven't seen him yet. But that's when Jesus shows up and says, do not be afraid. His disciples were locked in a room because they were afraid that the same people who had given Jesus over to the Romans were going to now come after them, and that they were going to experience that same persecution. And so they were literally locked into a room, fearing for their lives. And Jesus shows up and says, peace be with you. And I think Jesus shows up in our lives right this very moment, this morning, telling us, do not be afraid, because I'm alive. Peace be with you, because I am alive and I am with you, and I am your peace. But do you hear Jesus' voice? Do you hear him telling you to cast those fears away because he is alive? It's interesting. Scientifically, it's been proven that a mother's voice raises the oxytocin levels in a young baby. That hormone that causes a baby to feel secure and safe and to feel like there's someone who's going to take care of them. As soon as a baby hears their mother's voice, they start to feel secure. They start to feel like, okay, I'm going to be all right. Simultaneously, once the baby hears its mother's voice, the cortisol level begins to drop. And then that stress begins to slowly dissipate and fade away. That's the power of a mother's voice. Fathers don't always have that same power, unfortunately. I can talk to my kids in the most soothing voice. They're still going to cry until mom comes. But aren't there people in our lives who have that kind of presence? Who have that kind of voice where when we hear their words, we start to calm down? Those fears start to maybe fade a little bit? That's Jesus' voice in the lives of the people that he loves. Do not be afraid. Because Jesus doesn't want us to get into that tomb that he just got out of. Fear is a tomb. Fear paralyzes you. Fear keeps you locked in. And so whatever it is that you're afraid of, whether it be death or losing your job, or the security of your children or your grandchildren, whether it's just the fear of a world that seems chaotic and we don't know what's going to happen, Jesus invites us out of the tomb of fear into a place where we are secure in him, when he tells us, do not be afraid. John chapter 20, I know I'm making you go, kind of jump back and forth. John chapter 20, verse 24. John chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. When the other disciples told him that they had seen the Lord, he declared, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Sometimes Jesus shows up in our lives with that calm, reassuring voice, saying that everything's going to be okay, that our fear doesn't hold a candle to His power in the resurrection. Sometimes He nudges us gently and softly to faith and to believing that everything's going to be all right. But sometimes Jesus shows up and He says the same thing that He said to Thomas: "Stop doubting and just believe." Sometimes He just tells us straightforward, stop doubting. Believe in what I'm saying. Believe in who I am. Believe in what has taken place in my life, that same reality can be your own. God, through the resurrected Jesus, speaks into our place of doubt, into that tomb that we sometimes get into, where we don't really believe. The thing about doubt is it creeps into our lives. It creeps into our hearts slowly. It's usually not something that's obvious. We don't give ourselves over to doubt. Doubt creeps into us because we've been disenfranchised, because we've been hurt or wounded in certain situations, because somebody hasn't fulfilled a promise. We start to think in terms of, well, I don't know if that's going to happen. Or I don't know if that's going to work out. Doubt creeps in, but once it's in there, it wreaks havoc on our hope. Because once faith dies, once your belief is gone, then hope dies with it. And once hope has died, joy dies too. That's where the disciples found themselves early. Well, throughout Friday and Saturday and early Sunday morning, they found themselves in disbelief, doubting. How many times do you see in the accounts of the resurrection that even though they were seeing Jesus, some still doubted? Even though some of their own friends were telling them, Jesus is alive, He has risen, we went to the tomb, He's no longer there, and yet they still doubted. Doubt creeps in and it wreaks havoc on our joy. And I don't think any of us doubt the reality of the resurrection. And I don't think any of us doubt God's ability to raise us from the grave. But we struggle with doubts. We struggle a little bit with doubts in our own lives. We can get into that place where we're saying, I'm praying about this, but I don't know if God's really going to do this. Or I don't know if this situation really can or will change. Doubts creep in and they wreak havoc on our joy. But Jesus shows up in the midst of our doubts and He says, stop doubting and believe. Give in to that spark of hope that says, this is real. This will happen. This can happen. Things can change. The situation can be turned around because Jesus present in our lives, resurrected, shows us that anything is possible. Anything can change. Death is not the end. Jesus shows up and He beckons us to come out of that tomb of doubt and into the glorious reality of faith and hope and joy. But do you hear His voice? Do you hear His voice this morning telling you those words? Stop doubting and believe. Back to Matthew chapter 28. Verse 10b, Jesus has already told the women, do not be afraid, but now He says, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Go and tell. In verse 16 it says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw Him, they worshipped Him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I will be with you always to the very end of the age." The last thing that Jesus tells his disciples, Jesus' words in the resurrection, "Go and tell. Go and make disciples. What you have seen, what you have experienced, what you have witnessed, what you have heard, pass it on. Share it. Go out into the world where darkness still feels like the reality, where death still feels like the overwhelming truth. Go out into the world where people aren't accustomed to hearing good news, and tell them about me. Tell them that I'm alive. Tell them that if they are in me, that they are alive too." How often do you ask yourself, what's my purpose in life? What am I here for? What am I supposed to be doing? What is the purpose of my existence? I think we've all been in that place where we ask ourselves, what should I be doing? Jesus' disciples, after he had died, they had no idea what they should be doing. And that's why they locked themselves in the room, because they couldn't even fathom what life was going to be like without Jesus. And when he shows up, he doesn't have a long theological conversation with them about the ins and outs of the resurrection. He doesn't have this class reunion where they kind of live out the glory days again and talk about how good it was before. Jesus tells them, "Go and tell. Go and make disciples." In the resurrection, Jesus tells us that we are to make our story about his story. That the point of our story is to tell his story and to share that hope and that joy that come through faith in the resurrection to the people around us. And so whatever you're dealing with this morning, whether it's some kind of fear, whether it's some bit of doubt, or whether it's just a lack of purpose and clarity in your life as to what it is that you're supposed to be living for and doing, allow Jesus in the resurrection to share God's voice with you and to speak into that place where you're struggling and to tell you, do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Stop doubting and believe. And now go and tell people that I am alive. And when Jesus speaks into those dark places of our lives, those places that we sometimes don't even want to recognize exist, then we too are resurrected with him. We're able to walk out of that tomb and leave fear behind. We're able to get up and leave doubt in the past and leave the tomb of obscurity and confusion and complacency empty. And it's because of that resurrection power that he gives to each and every one of those who believe in him.